With the Super Smash Bros. Series being a multiplayer fighting game, it's expected that most of your playtime will be dedicated to fighting other people. However, believe it or not, there are actually a few other things you can fight once you get bored of repeatedly beating up Olimar. These extra opponents come in the form of the game's 10 bosses. These range from Smash original creations to being based on other franchises. Sometimes they can be in the middle. These boss fights are found within the game's World of Light Adventure mode and its Classic mode. Now, if you've watched a few of my videos before, you may know that I used to speedrun Classic mode a bit. I haven't had time to in a while, but hopefully once I graduate or something, I'll be able to get back to it. What am I saying? Why would I want to go back? It's maddening. But anyway, the point is, I'm quite familiar with most of these bosses from there. After having to fight each of them so many times though, it was apparent that some of them are better than others. So today, I'm going to rank every boss in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate from the worst to the best. Now how exactly am I going to be ranking these? Because there are quite a few ways you could. While I'm going to follow a similar approach to my Final Smash ranking where it comes down to how much I like the boss personally. Is the boss challenging without being annoying? Are the mechanics behind the boss fun and creative? And questions like that will be mainly what's deciding the order of this list. I'll also say that this ranking was incredibly close. I could understand putting anyone in the top half of this list at number 1. So what I'm saying is, if my opinion is different than yours, that just means you're wrong. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and let's jump right into the list. I think this is gonna be the fastest I get murdered by the comment section on any of my lists. 12. Galeem and Darkon. I feel like this is probably a very well liked fight, however I am personally just not a huge fan of it for a number of reasons. Before we get to that though, you may be wondering why I said this is at 12th when I said at the start there are 10 bosses. Well, that's because there are 2 additional fights that combine 2 bosses into one, and this is our first example of that. This obviously combines Galeem and Darkon, the 2 main bosses for World of Light. We'll get more into the specifics behind each of their attacks in their own segment, but why do I think the combined fight is the worst in the game? Well, simply put, I just find it very annoying. It is without a doubt the single hardest fight in the game, which I guess makes sense as it's required to get World of Light's true ending. Their attacks though just don't stack very well together. In this fight, you can very easily be put in a situation where it's impossible or near impossible to dodge one of their attacks. Both of them have very large hitboxes, and some of their attacks even fill up the whole screen, so when there's 2 of them doing these attacks at once, it can be very annoying. They also ramp up the intensity of these attacks as you go on, meaning you can very easily get murdered right at the end for getting unlucky. Oh, and on top of that, just in case you don't have a Nintendo Switch Online subscription, you can experience the wonderful lag of online through this fight. The Switch just can't handle 2 of these guys at the same time, especially after you've killed one, which is just about the worst time for the game to slow down since you really don't want to lose near the end. So for those reasons, this fight is just not fun for me. This is definitely not all bad though. It's got a bit to it that still makes me think it's alright. For starters, it's got a good concept, as the bosses are actually attacking each other. Yes, they are also attacking you at the same time, but since they can damage each other, you can use that to your advantage. Whenever you knock one down, the other one will deal a massive amount of damage to them, which I do think is a really cool idea. You're also technically given 3 lives to complete this fight, though it works like Squad Strike. That makes it slightly less annoying when they do an undodgeable attack, but it doesn't fully fix the fight. The last problem I want to say about it though comes down to actually getting to the fight itself. It's the only boss to not have an easy way to rematch it, as you have to go through the entire climbing sequence and boss rush in World of Light every single time. That's not a huge problem, but I personally think it is a bit tedious. Before we move on, I also want to end each segment by talking about the boss's song. I think this one is just alright. It does the job, but it's definitely not something I would listen to outside the game. 11. Master Hand. Being the face of Smash Bros. Bosses, well, I guess it doesn't really have a face. Being the main boss of the Super Smash Bros. Series, Master Hand is of course pretty iconic. However, compared to the other bosses, he's pretty basic. I mean, that's sort of the point, so I'm not really mad about it, but also I can't really justify placing him up too much higher. He doesn't really have any special gimmicks, just some pretty basic attacks to throw at you. He's got 15 different moves, so let's just run through them really fast. He can slap you, which I think makes sense for a big hand. He can curl up into a fist and slam down onto you. He's able to turn himself into a gun and shoot you. He can become a drill. Mario Wonder reference. When he goes off into the background, he'll be able to shoot several projectiles at you. He's able to fly like an airplane into the background as well. If he drags his finger on the floor, he can create spikes. Oh, also while we're on this, if you can get Master Hand to slam down onto these spikes, it'll stun him, so keep that in mind. Speaking of his finger, he has a few attacks dedicated to shooting lasers out of it. One is just a simple flyby as lasers come out, which kind of looks a bit weird, but whatever. The other attack has in place a bunch of mirrors that reflect his beam across the stage. This is probably my favorite attack just because it's cool to see how the lasers bounce around. around. For some projectiles, he could throw paintballs, iron spike balls, and even some chakram. His last 2 attacks have to do with snapping, as he can either stun the player or teleport away. But yeah, he's got a solid selection of attacks, but nothing super unique. He is generally pretty fun to fight, him floating around can make it tricky to reach, but finally being able to knock him down always feels great. Now, if I were to say one main problem with this guy, he's just used way too much. Since he's the generic boss, he's used as the ending for more classic mode routes than anyone else. 37 different characters fight Master Hand at the end of their route, which is absurd. That's not even including when it's paired up with Crazy Hand, meaning the total is actually 51 if you plan on going for 9.9 on every route. So yeah, while there's technically nothing wrong with the fight, you sort of get tired of it after a while. As for the music, I also just think it's sort of okay. I'd put it below Galeem and Darkon's theme. 10. Crazy Hand. This fight is pretty similar to Master Hand, but his attacks are slightly more goofy. Dang, that's crazy. Yeah, so the reason I listed out everything Master Hand can do is so that we can compare him to Crazy Hand. They do share a few attacks, as Crazy Hand can also slap, drill, finger beam, grab, and teleport. Oh, he can also airplane. As for his new attacks, he can drop bombs from his fingers, extend his finger to be really long, cast a beam of light to stun opponents, send out 5 blue fireballs, create a black hole, create a shockwave, crawl around on the floor, and even have a stroke on the floor. So as you can see, Crazy Hand's attacks are generally a bit more wild and wacky, which I think makes his fight a bit more interesting. Really though, his placing comes down to the fact that you have to fight him less. Only Falco and Ken's classic mode routes end with a solo Crazy Hand fight, and even then, that's only on difficulties below 7.0. Of course, you do still run into him a lot with the combined fight, but his slightly lower appearance rate does make him a bit better than Master Hand to me. I do think his song is a bit worse though, but the more creative attacks are enough to put him above Master Hand. 9. Galeem. Alright, finally back to this guy. If I'm gonna be honest, I still kind of find his and Darkon's fights to be pretty annoying. They're both meant to be hard, but the fights can honestly get pretty frustrating since slipping up slightly can end an attempt. Also, I made the grave mistake of fighting these two as Steve for this video. Why did I do that? He can't jump. What is wrong with me? I'm not gonna go over every attack this guy has, but there are quite a few notable ones that can be sort of tough to avoid but are pretty creative. First off, he can create several lines on the screen at once, giving you a limited amount of time to find a spot with no lines before he attacks. If below half health, he'll also do this attack twice in a row. It's always fun to try and scramble quickly into a good spot, so this attack is pretty cool. I also like when he tries to slam down his wing things into the stage, especially below half health as they fly down pretty quick. As for an attack both him and Darkon share, once they hit half health, they'll do this weird wave attack, and it's always fun to try and avoid taking damage, though it's pretty unclear how deep you have to be to start getting hurt. Like, you could be pretty far inside the wave and be perfectly fine, so I kind of wish that was made a bit more clear. However, the thing I think puts Galeem below Darkon comes to one move that I just think is stupid. Essentially, he'll just start spawning rings that grow out and deal a ton of damage if they hit you. You're forced to air dodge or spot dodge through them, but depending on how the rings were sent out, that can just lead to you hitting another ring. This attack is always super frustrating, and the worst part is he doesn't always do it. So it feels like you have to just get lucky that he doesn't do it during the fight. This is especially bad in the combined version. In the solo fight, it's sort of manageable, but it's pretty much the main reason I don't like the combined one. At least the song is alright. I still think the combined version is the best one we've heard so far, but it's pretty solid. 8. Darkon. This one's gonna be pretty quick since I think most of my thoughts carry over from Galeem. Their set of attacks are completely different though, which is important to keep in mind. Darkon luckily doesn't have any attacks I find to be too obnoxious. You can pretty easily avoid them if you're paying attention. Sadly, I'm a Steve player and have no brain, so... I will say this comes with the downside of no attack being that particularly cool on this guy either. I'd say the closest is when you have to dodge his 5-pin stabbing at you by spot dodging at the right time, but nothing quite as interesting as Galeem's line attack. Still, I'd rather a fight be less annoying, and I think Darkon is just that. Plus, it was a cool surprise seeing him for the first time since all the advertising for World of Light was focused on Galeem. I do think Galeem's theme is slightly better, but Darkon's is probably right behind it in terms of how much I like it. 7. Master Hand and Crazy Hand. This of course combines the two hands together, and unlike the World of Light bosses, I actually think combining these two works far better. They won't actually attack each other since they're working as a team, but neither of them have attacks that are nearly unavoidable insta-kills when combined with an attack from the other hand, so this fight is actually quite fun rather than annoying. Finding the best way to dodge the two's attacks makes for a good challenge. I'll also say this is a pretty cool one to fight in speedruns since you have to try and knock them both down at the same time to get the most optimal damage. It can definitely be frustrating trying to do that, but when you get it, it's super satisfying. Oh, and speaking of classic mode runs, I am obligated to mention this glitch that cost me a world record one time.
Oh, what? I didn't even know I could do that. No! Wait! What? I can't hit him! He's in the background! What? No!
Well, aside from that, one other neat thing is that these two actually get a few unique attacks when put together. They can do a punch catch, run across the stage in opposite directions, create 3 massive damaging rings, electrocute the whole stage, shoot beams down towards the stage, and even zoom in the screen to make the blast zones closer. I think these attacks all work really well and are fun to avoid and deal with. In my opinion, this is a much better example of combining 2 bosses together. The only thing holding this back is, again, they're used a bit too much. The combined fight is at the end of 12 classic mode routes regardless of difficulty, and most solo, master, and crazy hand fights become the combined version at difficulty 7.0 and above. So at a point, you do get a bit bored of them, but I can't deny they are still pretty fun to fight. I'll also say their theme is probably my favorite so far. It really does do a good job selling the intensity of the fight. 6. Giga Bowser. We are finally free of the Smash Bros. Original bosses. Kind of. See, despite Giga Bowser clearly being based on Bowser from the Mario series, he's actually considered to be Smash original. The Giga Bowser form comes from Melee's Adventure Mode, where Bowser will transform into him at the end. It's basically just meant to be a bigger and meaner Bowser though, so I'll personally always consider it to be a Mario series boss. Since I am a big Mario fan, I of course think this guy is really cool. Giga Bowser's moves are pretty much just spruced up versions of normal Bowser. That does make them pretty deadly, though they do have quite a bit of startup, so they can definitely be avoided. What's interesting though is it's actually not based on Ultimate Bowser, rather it's based on Melee Bowser. That means a few moves are a bit different, namely the forward smash, as it's not the dropkick seen in Ultimate, but instead it's Melee's weird headbutt. I like that they kept Giga Bowser close to his Melee roots, as it further distinguishes him from normal Bowser. Dodging all of this guy's attacks is quite a lot of fun, so I really enjoy this fight. I definitely think it should have been used a bit more throughout the game though, since it only appears in Mario, Captain Falcon, and Sephiroth's classic mode routes. I made a video a while back fixing a few classic mode routes, and let me just say, there were quite a few Giga Bowser could have fit in. So if I enjoy this fight so much, what puts it at number 6? Well, it all sort of comes back to the fact that he's considered to be a Smash Bros. Boss. That wouldn't normally be a problem, but it did make them just throw this fight on FD. Personally, I am sick of seeing this stage since the past 6 entries also take place on a variant of it. If this was considered to be a Mario boss, we could have gotten a unique Bowser's Castle themed arena. I would have liked that a lot, especially since they still, for some reason, don't have a Bowser's Castle stage in Smash. You can get a Bowser's Castle variant on Paper Mario. From this point on in the list, every boss gets its own unique stage dedicated to it, so I think Giga Bowser not having one definitely hurts him. This Smash Bros. Original logic can also sort of be applied to the song as well. Now I do want to say, I really like Giga Bowser's theme, easily my favorite so far. But the thing is, it's based on Melee's FD theme rather than a Bowser theme. I like pretty much every Bowser theme in the Mario series a ton, so getting more remixes of those would have been nice. Still, this is a really fun boss, it's just lacking a bit aesthetically. 5. Dracula. Okay, so here's technically our first non-Smash Bros. Series boss, as Dracula, of course, comes from the Castlevania series. Of all the series to get a boss fight in Ultimate, it was a bit surprising that Castlevania was one of them. Still though, I think adding him in was definitely a good choice. He has a very unique mechanic where he can only take damage if hit in the head. Now bear with me here, I've never played a Castlevania game, the only scary games I play are Five Nights at Freddy's, but I believe this mechanic is lifted straight from the series. I like how this really makes you think about your character's moveset and what moves are the best damage-wise that can still reach his head. I do have to say though that some of his attacks can be a bit annoying, the main one definitely being this weird spiral of damaging orbs. It is his rarest attack, so most of the time it's a non-issue, but if it appears, it can be kind of frustrating. Now on top of Dracula's unique head mechanic, he also has something else the other bosses don't, that being a second phase. After killing Dracula, he'll then transform and have a whole new set of attacks. Now you don't have to hit him on the head, but Dracula himself is a lot more mobile and deadly. Personally though, I feel like this phase drags the fight down a bit. I can't really explain why, but I don't really had that much fun fighting this phase. It's not that it's annoyingly hard or anything, I just think maybe its attacks are a bit too weird, I'm not really sure. Either way, its first phase was pretty good, so I think it deserves to be here. Like Giga Bowser though, I do wish he was used a bit more, as he only appears in Luigi, Pac-Man, Simon, Richter, and Sephiroth's classic routes. One other thing that helps this out of course is the aesthetic, as this takes place in a unique Dracula's Castle based arena. The music here is also pretty good, there's actually 2 songs, one for each phase. I definitely like the first song more, but the second phase isn't too bad either. 4. Gallium. And we've reached our final Smash original boss for this video. What makes this guy so special is the fact that he's actually a throwback to Super Smash Bros. Brawl's Subspace Emissary. I think it was cool that at least one boss from there got to make it into a future title, and besides Taboo, I'd say he was probably the most recognizable. What helps this guy out a ton in the rankings is that he's easily the most fun boss to fight in a classic mode speedrun. He even appears in a solid amount of them when compared to the other non-hand bosses, as he makes an appearance in the classic mode routes for Dark Pit, Snake, Rob, Bob, Wolf, Mega Man, King K. Rool, Min Min, and Sephiroth. His attacks are all fairly easy to distinguish from one another, making playing around them a bit easier and overall more fun. He also doesn't have any attack that sends him out of reach for too long. Most of the other bosses have moves that render them unable to be hit for quite a long time, but Gallium is almost always within reach. I don't really have too much more to add on here since I don't really have any issues. The closest thing to a problem here is that the song is pretty forgettable, but even then, I think it's probably just under the second phase Dracula fight in terms of how much I like it. I mean, he even got his own arena despite being a Smash original boss. I think Gallium just does pretty much everything right. 3. Rathalos. And here we have our only boss to come from a franchise not represented at all on the roster. Rathalos comes from the Monster Hunter series, and I personally think this is a really good way to represent that franchise. I'm sure Monster Hunter fans would rather have a character, but I think this fits pretty well. Another interesting thing about this boss is the fact that unlike the rest, it's also an assist trophy. That didn't play a part in its ranking since I'm mostly just judging the fight, but that is a pretty interesting thing to note. But anyways, how is the fight itself? Well, it's actually got a surprising amount of unique mechanics. Rathalos himself just has some pretty basic attacks, mostly just shooting fireballs, roaring, or hitting the player with a part of their body. As the fight goes on though, they'll eventually be able to fly up into the air where they can then strike the player with their claws. While they're in the air, it also makes it pretty challenging to hit them. Rathalos also appears in a solid amount of routes while we're at it, appearing in the classic mode routes for Yoshi, Bowser, Marth, Duck Hunt, Piranha Plant, Hero, and Sephiroth. What really makes this fight for me though comes down to the items. Unlike the other fights, a few items will spawn in to help you, and they all interact with Rathalos in a unique way. The most common one you'll get is a Deku Nut, which can be used to stun Rathalos. However, it will only stun him if it hits his head, which I think is a brilliant mechanic. It's so much fun trying to line up the perfect item toss to get a ton of free damage. Depending on where he is, it can even be quite difficult. The next item is the Pitfall Seed. This really has two uses. One, you can put it on the ground, which will bury Rathalos if he runs over it. However, if you don't want to wait for him to run, then you can hit him with it while he's flying and it will instantly stun him. Again, that's a more really unique item usage. You can also get bombs and explosive barrels here, though they are extremely rare. So mechanically, I really love this fight. While it can be a bit annoying when he flies out of range, I overall think this is fantastic. The aesthetic isn't the most interesting thing, the stage and music are just sort of okay, but I'm not gonna let that take away too much from my enjoyment here. 2. Marx. This is an absolutely perfect boss choice. He comes from the Kirby series and is definitely one of its most iconic bosses, probably only behind King Dedede, Meta Knight, and Wispy Woods, all of which already have a role in Smash Ultimate. Marx's fight is very heavily inspired by his fight in Kirby Superstar, where he acts as that game's big twist villain. Oh yeah, spoilers! Since Kirby bosses basically work the exact same as bosses in Smash, most of the mechanics and attacks here are ripped directly from that original fight. That makes this fight one of my absolute favorites for being so accurate to the original source material. I mean, let's just compare some of these attacks. Both can fly into the sky and drop down seeds that grow into plants, shoot out a massive laser, come up from portals in the ground, teleport around the arena, split in half to reveal a black hole, shoot out these spinning rings, shoot out this ball that splits into two, and so on. I would say this is probably the single most accurate boss fight in the game, and for that, I love it a lot. It's certainly helped by the fact that I do also like the Kirby series, so it's nice to see it get a boss. If I were to say a criticism though, he is probably the most guilty out of any boss of spending too much time out of reach. He often decides to fly off screen or go through portals, which is entirely decided by randomness. That means his fight in a classic mode speedrun is brutal, because you could do everything right, but just get the worst RNG possible. That's not too big of a concern here though, as he sadly only appears in 4 routes: Kirby, Cringe, Inkling, and Sephiroth. Yeah, that makes speedrunning slightly less of a pain, but it is still a shame he appears so infrequently. Back to positives though, the aesthetic is amazing. The stage here looks so cool and unique from any other setting in the game. It really makes me wish we could fight on an Omega version of this stage in normal Smash battles. It looks really good. What's even better though is the music, easily the best one we've seen so far. I love this remix a ton, it's an absolutely fantastic theme. 1. Ganon. While the competition was pretty close, I think Ganon can just about pass the other bosses to be my favorite in Smash Ultimate. He's of course taken from the Zelda franchise, more specifically his fight from Ocarina of Time. First off, it's nice that Ganon is getting some pretty good representation, considering Ganondorf is still struggling with that to this day.
I love Warlock Punch, it's so slow and cool.
But yeah, I like the Zelda series, especially the N64 games, so I'm already pretty happy with this choice for a boss fight. As for the fight itself, he has a very similar mechanic to Dracula where you have to hit a specific perfect part of him to deal damage. Instead of it being his head though, it's his tail. This provides for a very unique challenge, so you have to try and find a way to get to his tail in the first place. You can't just run through him, so most of the time you have to go over, which puts you dangerously close to his attacks. These are usually different types of slashes with his sword, but he does occasionally throw out a few projectiles. I think this idea just works really well. It's fun to find the perfect moment to get behind him and deal a ton of damage to his tail. It's also super satisfying when you manage to stun him as well, as he will usually turn around pretty quickly when you start hitting him. The way his tail is set up also lets you do a fun thing with most characters' down smashes, as you can get both sides of the down smash to hit if you stand inside of his tail. So yeah, I'm a really big fan of this tail mechanic. Oh, and I should probably mention, the tail weakness is lifted straight from Ocarina of Time, making this a very faithfully adapted boss. I also just don't really have any criticisms here. Like Gallium, he stays within reach for pretty much the whole fight, as he has no background related attacks. That means you're constantly able to deal damage as long as you can get to the tail, which I think makes this fight pretty fun. Really, the only negative I have here is the fact that he doesn't show up as much as he should, only appearing in routes for Zelda characters, those being Link, Young Link, Toon Link, and Zelda. Oh, and also Sephiroth, but he doesn't count. I definitely feel like a few more routes could have worked with him. Besides that though, the aesthetic here is also nearly perfect. The stage is fantastic, another one I definitely wish could have been fought on in versus mode. The burning down tower setting from Ocarina of Time is phenomenal and acts as a perfect place for this fight. The song is actually pretty interesting since there's two different themes used. Most of the time it's Calamity Ganon Battle second form, which is a pretty solid choice, just not my absolute favorite. However, in Zelda's route, the fight actually uses the song Death Mountain, and that is my absolute favorite. I've used this remix in a ton of my videos, absolutely my favorite ultimate boss theme. So for being a fantastic reference to the Zelda series, along with being a ton of fun to fight, I think Ganon is my favorite boss in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. But anyways, that's it for this video. Are you a Xenoblade fan who's seething that I didn't include Metal Face despite him just being a stage hazard? Let me know in the comments. Honestly, before making this video, I thought it was going to be super short since it only had 12 things to rank, but I apparently had a surprising amount to say here. That kinda sucks for me since I wanted to make a shorter video to prepare for Mario Wonder's release, but hey, I think this turned out to be a good video anyway, so why complain? But anyways, dry bones for Smash, and I'll see you guys next time.